Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Ruben speaking to you from south of Jerusalem. Today is the 20th day of the month of Cheshvan, 5783. It's November 14th, 2022. I'm actually recording this edition of Temple Talk a day earlier than usual because of a very, very busy schedule this week. So I want to record while I have the opportunity. This coming Shabbat is Parashat Chayei Sara, the life of Sara, beginning in the book of Genesis, chapter 23, verse 1, concluding chapter 25, verse 18. It's also Shabbat Mevarchim, meaning it's the Shabbat that we bless. The upcoming new moon / new month of Kislev, which will be next week, next Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, Friday, a 2-day Rosh Chodesh celebration, Rosh Chodesh holiday for the new month of Kislev. Kislev, of course, is the month of the holiday of Chanukah, which begins in the 25th day of Kislev and actually continues over to the first few days of the following month of Tevet, the only holiday on the Hebrew calendar that actually extends over 2 months. And Kislev, also known as the month of dreams, because there's a few reasons, and many of those reasons are very mystical, very steeped in Kabbalistic knowledge. But simply put, there's 2 quite clear reasons. One is that it is a month where the nights are the longest and the days are the shortest, meaning that there's more time to dream. We sleep more and we dream more. But also it is the month in which the Parshiot, the Torah readings that involved beginning with Vayeshev, etc., or actually beginning with Vayetze, which we have the dream of Yaakov when he has a dream and sees a ladder going up into heaven, wakes and says, I will establish the house of Hashem here. And then, of course, the dreams of Yosef and the dreams of Pharaoh, they all take place in Torah readings that we read throughout the month of Kislev. So it is a month of dreams, and dreams are considered to be very, very significant, very important in Jewish lore, in Jewish knowledge, in Jewish tradition. Not every dream is full of meaning, and many dreams will have some dross, but there will be some kernels of meaning, and dream interpretation is very important, but also you have to be cautious, and if you want to have your dreams interpreted, you need to go to someone who knows, who's an expert. And if you have a dream that has frightened you and you don't want that dream to come true, then there are tefillot, there are prayers, and even a ceremony for overcoming, let's say, a bad dream and turning it into a good dream or nullifying it. So dreams are very important in, as I said, in Jewish life, as I assume they are very important for everybody. Next week's Temple Talk is going to be a little bit different. I wanted to let you know now so you can make sure to listen. Next week's Temple Talk, I'm not going to be talking about the Parashat or even about the upcoming Rosh Chodesh, upcoming Kislev. I'm going to be turning over the microphone to Hanan Kupietsky. Hanan is the man. He's the man who was inspired to bring red heifers to Israel. And he is the man who made tremendous efforts over the past, I think about 3 years, to do so. And he has an amazing, fascinating story that he's going to share with us next week. I've interviewed him actually already, but we're going to be broadcasting it next week. So next week's Temple Talk, which I think will probably be a little bit longer than usual because he has a lot to say, is all going to be all about the red heifer. So please stay tuned and listen in. I'm sure you're going to find it very, very fascinating. It really is an amazing story. And it just shows us how Hashem is in our world. He's right here. He's working with us behind the scenes, sometimes not behind the scenes, but whatever we do, whatever happens, whatever inspiration we have, there's a reason for it, and there's a power behind it, and there's an energy that is moving it forward. So that's next week. We'll be listening to Hanan. Let's get back to this week's Parashat Chayei Sara, and also this week I want to talk about another holiday that is coming next week. Actually, it will be next Tuesday evening, Wednesday, and it is actually the last day of the month of Cheshvan, the 29th of Cheshvan, and that holiday is called Sigd. If you recall a few weeks ago when we were welcoming in the month of Cheshvan on Temple Talk, we talked about Cheshvan has no holidays in it, and so it's sometimes referred to as Mar Cheshvan, meaning bitter Cheshvan, because there's no holidays after all the holidays of the previous month of Tishrei. All of a sudden we have no holidays. It's actually is, or was, I should say, the only month in the Hebrew calendar that had absolutely no holiday whatsoever. But I said things are changing, that there are actually two holidays, two special days now in the month of Cheshvan, and one of them we already honored and celebrated a few weeks ago, and that was what we now dub as Rambam Day, meaning the anniversary of the day that Maimonides, the great sage Maimonides, some between 800 and 900 years ago, ascended the Temple Mount, went to Jerusalem, went from Morocco, sailed to Akko in northern coast of Israel, and then traveled by foot, of course, down to Jerusalem, where he ascended the Temple Mount on the 6th of Cheshvan and prayed there and declared that it would be a holiday for his descendants forever and ever. And then a few days later, he actually continued and traveled into Hevron, where he prayed at the Machpelah Cave, which is very, very relevant also to this week's Parashat, because this is the week of Avraham's purchase of the burial site of the cave of Machpelah. And the second holiday, of course, in Cheshvan, is an old new holiday. It's actually many hundreds of years old. Exactly when it began, nobody's sure, but it certainly has been around for many hundreds of years, and that is the holiday of Sigd, which is a holiday that was celebrated by the Ethiopian Jewish community, and the Ethiopian Jewish community, which has returned to Israel over these past decades, was the oldest exiled community. Their exile began some 2,700 years ago, during the First Temple period, actually, very unique in that respect. And during those 2,700 years, they were, by and large, cut off from the other Jewry, either in Israel or later on in the diaspora, the exiled communities. And so they really had no knowledge for many, many centuries of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, of rabbinic Judaism. And their Judaism stems from the way it was practiced in the First Temple period. And of course, like every other life organizing principle, it evolved over the centuries, over the millennia, but it really is their traditional Judaism was a remnant of the ancient way of practicing Judaism of the Torah in the First Temple period, and so there is so much to learn from their traditions. It's almost like archaeology, but we're not talking about stones, we're not talking about ancient scrolls, we're talking about living traditions. However, I must add, now that the Ethiopian community is in Israel and numbers some 150,000 or so members, they have, by and large, adopted the Judaism, the daily practice of Judaism that other Jews, whether they're Sephardi Jews or Ashkenazi Jews, practice. And in that way, they have rejoined the tradition, or joined for the first time the tradition that they never were a part of before. It's a very fascinating story. It's a very inspiring story. There's many things online about it if you'd like to learn more. There's many books written about it. It has all the elements. First of all, their history is fascinating. Second of all, their aliyah, their ascent, return to Israel is fascinating. It's an adventure. And I encourage everybody to check into it. So we're going to talk about a little more about that and about Sigd very soon in this week's Temple Talk. But let's talk a little bit first about Parashat Chayei Sara. We'll read the first few verses in Hebrew, then in English, beginning with chapter 23, verse 1. We're in the book of Genesis. Vayihiyu Chayei Sara mea shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sara vatamot Sara bekiryat arba hi Hevron be'eretz Canaan vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sara v'lifkota. Okay, Sarah's lifetime was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years, the years of Sarah's life. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hevron in the land of Canaan. And Avraham came to eulogize Sarah and to weep her. Avraham rose up from the presence of his dead and spoke to the children of Hit, saying, I am an alien and a resident among you. Grant me an estate for a burial site with you, that I may bury my dead from before me. So we're 20 generations into mankind. This is the 20th generation following Adam Harishon, following Adam and Eve. And this is the first time in the Torah that, it's been mentioned for 20 generations that someone was born, they had children, they died. But this is the first time that it focuses on a death. And this, of course, is the death of Sarah, our matriarch, our first matriarch. And she died. She died right before this. We're reading about the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak, and again, our sages traditionally make the connection between the binding of Yitzchak and the death of Sarah, and there's many different understandings. But one understanding I'll share with you is simply that Avraham, we know that he got up early and rushed off to do this, to do the binding of Yitzchak, to offer him up. That was the commandment. And he did so without mentioning anything to Sarah. But according to one tradition, Sarah actually heard about it, and she heard about it from the Satan, from the Satan, who actually is a troublemaker, as we all know. And she understood that her son Yitzhak had actually been offered up and had been killed. And so her life went out of her, and she collapsed and died on the spot. Again, the idea is to try to make a logical connection between why does this story immediately follow, why does the story of Sarah's death immediately follow the story of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. And that's one understanding. The Torah doesn't mention that at all. It just mentions that she's 127 years old, and she died. And so another new thing which we haven't heard of before in the Torah's review of the first 20 generations of mankind is that Avraham weeps for her. He's in mourning. And he eulogized her. Vayavo Avraham lispod. Hesped is a eulogy. He spoke of her. We don't know. We don't have his words. But that must have been very fascinating. He was speaking, his son Yitzhak was with him, and we assume, and the children of Chet, the people of Chet, were the residents of Kiryat Arba, which is Hevron, and we don't know what he said, but he eulogized Sarah, and he wanted to buy a burial site. So again, this is something new. We haven't heard about this. We don't know what the traditions were before this time in terms of when someone dies. Now, maybe Avraham is is just following an ancient tradition, even in his day. Now we do know he asked to purchase a burial plot from the children of Sigd. So apparently there was a tradition of burying, and the burial plot was a cave. And for many, many centuries, through the Second Temple period, and perhaps beyond, I don't know the details myself, but certainly through the Second Temple period, people were buried in caves. And they would be put in a cave, and a year later, when the bodies had decomposed and what was left were the bones would be gathered up and put into an ossuary, a stone box, which could be kept, I guess, wherever it would be kept. I imagine a stone box was for, I don't know, wealthier people. Maybe they had stone boxes with silver on them. I don't know. But that's how it was done. So the Machpelah Cave, which Avraham, he negotiated a price for, and as we know, it's a very interesting negotiation between him and Hevron, who had a burial site, Hevron ben Zohar, and ben Sohar, I should say, Hevron ben Sohar. And he at one point said to Avraham, I'll just give it to you. And Avraham said, no, I want to purchase this. I want to purchase it so it's not a gift. It's mine. And this, of course, is the first land purchase by Avraham, the father of the children of Israel in the land of Israel. So this is hugely significant. It's one of 3 land purchases specifically recorded in the Torah. The first is this, Hevron, the Machpelah Cave. And the second is the burial site of Yosef, which is in the city of Shechem, also known as Nablus. And the third, of course, is the threshing floor of I just can't think of his name right now, the Jebusite that King David purchased from him, his threshing floor, to build an altar, which became the site of the Holy Temple. Solomon built it there, and that, of course, is Mount Moriah. And so these are 3 places in the land of Israel, 3 sites which are recorded. The actual transaction is recorded. How much Avraham paid for it, how much Yaakov paid for the land that Yosef was eventually buried on, and David's purchase of the threshing floor from Aravna. Anyway, so this is a huge thing. This Machpelah Cave, Machpelah is from the word kefil, which means double. It's a cave with a double chamber. And in it today, of course, Sara was the first of the matriarchs or patriarchs to be buried in it, but buried in it today are Sara and Avraham, Yitzhak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah. Rachel, as we know, was buried on the way to Efrat, Derech Ephrata, along the road, and she is not buried in the cave alongside either her husband or the other matriarchs or patriarchs. And also, we know, I think we mentioned it in last week's Temple Talk, there is a tradition that also buried in the Machpelah Cave are Adam and Eve, that Avraham himself discovered this. If you recall, according to Midrash, when he went to chase after the bakar, the cow that he wanted to slaughter and feed, the 3 men / angels who came to visit him and would tell him of the glad tidings of the birth of a son by Sara. The son, of course, would be Yitzhak. And as he chased this cow went into a cave, and Avraham followed, and Avraham entered into this chamber where he saw an illuminated chamber in which he saw the bodies of Adam and Eve lying each on a bed of stone. And he realized that he had entered into Gan Eden, into the Garden of Eden. So the Machpelah Cave is an entrance into the Garden of Eden, and it is a super holy site to the Jewish people. Because it is the site in which our matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. It is the site that is connected to the Garden of Eden. And of course, Hevron, the city in which the Machpelah Cave was a city that was part of the inheritance of the tribe of Judah, and it was a city in which King David ruled for 7 years before he conquered and began to rule from Jerusalem. So it is a hugely significant city for Israel, for the people of Israel. It is a hugely holy, second in holiness only to the Temple Mount. And Jews have been living continuously in Hebron with one exception, and that was after the 1929 pogrom slaughter of the Jews by their Arab neighbors, which during the British Mandate, and the few Jews that survived, the British police forced to move out. And so between 1929 and 1967, there was not a single Jew living in Hebron. It was the only time since ancient times that no Jew was living in Hebron. And of course, after 67, I think in 68, the first Jewish presence was reestablished in Hebron. Also another fascinating story of politics and determination and faith, and it was a battle. But there is a small but very strong community of Jews in Hevron, and right alongside Hevron is the town of Kiryat Arba, which is sort of tacked right onto Hevron. It really borders Hevron, and of course that is a community of, I don't know, I haven't checked the numbers recently, but I would guess between 7,000 and 10,000 Jews who live in Kiryat Arba. And of course, the Machpelah Cave is a pilgrimage site for Jews and for Gentiles, for anybody who's connected to the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Of course, it's also a site for the Muslims. They have a mosque also at the site. And every year when it's Shabbat Parashat Chayei Sara, which is this coming Shabbat, there is a big gathering of Jews in Hevron. Thousands, many thousands of Jews gather there. It's, they don't really have the facilities to put people up the way they should be put up on Shabbat. So it really takes a tremendous amount of dedication and love and faith to be part of this gathering each year. But it's tremendous. It's been happening, I think, for about 30 years now. And each year seems to be bigger than the last. And that's how much we love Hevron. That's how much we love our matriarchs and our patriarchs. So Avraham buys this site, he buries Sara there, and then he turns his concerns to the future, and the future is getting Yitzchak married. Yitzchak needs to be married so that he can have children, so that the legacy can be carried on, so that God's promise can come true, that the children of Avraham will be many, they'll inherit the land, and all the nations will be blessed through them. So then we continue in the Parsha, in the reading to the one of the most wonderful stories. It's just so rich in detail and in character. We learn so much about the customs, about what was going on in those days, the jewelry, the style of speaking, the gathering at the well, the servant of Avraham. Avraham has his servant Eliezer swear to him that he will go to Haran, where Avraham's family is from, to seek out a bride for Yitzchak. He doesn't want Yitzchak to marry any of the locals. He wants someone from there, someone from his family. And he says, find someone. If you don't, then come back empty-handed. But Yitzchak's not going to leave Israel. Avraham says she has to come here. And if the girl you find says no, then it's not going to happen. And, you will have done your bit, and that will be that. We'll have to look elsewhere. But of course, as we know, Eliezer, who had tremendous initiative on his own, and we see from him, again, I want to talk about Sigd, so I'm going through this very quickly. We see from him, if you read the story, what a student he was of Avraham, and what a teacher Avraham was of the Torah that he was teaching, and of the presence of Hashem in the world, and the love for Hashem, that his servant conducted himself and rested all his hopes on Hashem, and basically made a deal with Hashem in order to find the proper bride for Yitzhak. And read it carefully and listen to the blessings that he says, and listen to the way he talks to the family of Rivka. And Rivka, of course, as we will discover, is a woman of tremendous strength, tremendous initiative, tremendous insight, tremendous judgment. And long story short, and it really is a long story short, in fact, the story of how he met Rivka at the well, that whole story is repeated 3 times in the Parsha, which is fascinating. You know, the Torah is known to be very, very, very succinct. It doesn't waste words. Yet, it finds it necessary to repeat this story 3 different times. And that's very fascinating in and of itself. So Rivka finally comes back with Eliezer, and of course there's a famous, beautiful passage at the very end of Chayei Sara when she rides in. She has never met Yitzchak yet, of course, and we read this. I'm just going to read it very carefully, very, very quickly, I should say. We're in chapter 24, verse 62. We'll start. Then Rivka arose with her maidens. They rode upon the camels and proceeded after the man being Eliezer. The servant took Rivka and went. Now Yitzchak came from having gone to Be'er Lachairoi, for he dwelt in the south country. Yitzchak went out to supplicate in the field towards evening prayer. And he raised his eyes and saw, and behold, camels were coming. And Rivka raised her eyes and saw Yitzchak. She inclined while upon the camel. Actually, literally, the Hebrew is she fell off her camel. And she said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field toward us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." She then took the veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Yitzchak all the things that he had done. And Yitzchak brought her, Rivka, into the tent of Sarah, his mother. He married Rivka, and she became his wife, and he loved her. And thus was Yitzchak consoled after his mother. So we're told again in Midrash that what was he doing in this field? He was the actual Hebrew is he was lasuach basadeh. He was meditating in the field. He was in prayer, deep meditation. And our tradition says that field that he was praying in was the Temple Mount, where actually the place where he had been brought to be offered up. Of course, the place of the Akedah, the binding of Yitzhak. Anyway, it's one of the most beautiful parshiot, Chayei Sara. It starts with the life of Sara, which is really the death of Sara, and it ends with it's just bursting with life. It's a parsha all about life. Let's just talk about Sigd for a few minutes. I talked to you a bit about before about the Ethiopian community, and again, very briefly, they lost contact with the rest of the Jewish community and communities around the world once Jews went into exile. And in the 8th century, there was a man who called himself Eldad Hadani, Eldad from the tribe of Dan, and he told of his adventures. He wrote something that he had been shipwrecked in the somewhere in the Red Sea, and he washed ashore in Africa, of course, by the coast of Ethiopia, and he was captured by some tribe, and then he was released by them. He ended up, ultimately, ended this adventure in this land where there were Jews living. Jews who were the descendants of I just want to get this right, descendants of the tribes of Dan, Asher, Gad, and Naphtali. And the major tribe, it seems, there were the tribe of Dan. And these tribes were independent, and these Jews were independent. He tells this wonderful story. You can find it online, certainly in Hebrew. I think you can find it also in English. It's not a long account. And he shared this account. He approached communities in North Africa, and he shared the account, and these people said, "Well, this is amazing, but is it true?" And so they asked one of the great sages at the time, who verified it. He said, "Yes, this man speaks the truth." So there was a community of Jews in Africa. And now, certainly some of his account is fanciful. That's how people wrote in those days, and of course in our days as well. But there certainly is more than a kernel of truth here. And there are other accounts. In fact, even the book of Isaiah and some of the other prophets talk about the Jews who are already in exile in Cush, which is the Hebrew word for the area which is today Ethiopia, the southern part of Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia was Cush. And of Cush, as we recall all the way back from the time of the first generations, Cush was a very important nation. In fact, Nimrod was the king of Cush, and he actually conquered and took over Babylon, where the great tower was built. So Cush was a very, very significant nation, and there were Jews living there. Historically, there certainly were Jews that left Israel during the First Temple period, and they went to an island in southern on the Nile in southern Egypt called Elephantine, and there they even built a mikdash, a temple, and were making offerings. You're going to ask me now, can you build a second temple? Can you build a temple out of Israel? It's a bit of a mystery, but they were in communication at that point with the sages in Jerusalem. In fact, we know about this community and this temple. They were mercenaries originally. We know about this community in Elephantine because of letters that have been recovered that were written back and forth or asking questions. One question was about the Passover offering. It's amazing. But this is true story. This is true story, and I'm not talking about Eldad Adani right now. I'm talking about other sources. And so and at one point the community was destroyed, and it's very, very likely that they moved south and entered into what is now Ethiopia and established themselves there. There was certainly a very, very strong Jewish presence in Ethiopia from time immemorial, and there's a very strong connection between Israel and Ethiopia in this way. Even the Ethiopian church has certain traditions, certain customs that are very Jewish, and that certainly tell of an ancient connection to Judaism, to ancient Judaism. Anyway, the Jewish community there became independent for many, many centuries, and in fact became very strong during the time, about the 15th, 16th century, the time when the Jews elsewhere were under tremendous duress, the exile from the expulsion from Spain, and destruction of so many communities. And word was of this community, of this strong independent nation with its own army in Ethiopia. And so some of the sages, like the Bartanora, whose commentary on the Mishnah we study to this day, he writes about them. The Radbaz, who was the great sage, the great rabbi of Egypt in the 15th century, he had direct contact with the community because at the time there were wars against the Ethiopian Jewish communities in Ethiopia, and at that time, if you lose a war and you have people taken prisoner, they become slaves. And so there were Ethiopians who were brought up into Egypt and sold as slaves, and some Jews purchased these slaves, these servants, and they discovered they were Jewish, and they went to the Radbaz and said, "What do we do?" He said, "They're Jews. You have to redeem them. You have to free them." So from that, we learn that even in those times, there was great knowledge about who they were and what they were about. I would love to talk about this more, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for being with me. Temple Talk.